Hi. Okay, Chapter 8 is the chapter that deals with sharing personal information, something commonly called self-disclosure. So this is the PowerPoint presentation, and I will go through this and sort of talk you through it as we hit it. So the first is defining self-disclosure. It's important to understand a few critical things about self-disclosure. First, it has to be personal information. In other words, things that are not necessarily obvious. If I say I'm a college professor, that's not considered self-disclosure because that's something that you already know. So it has to be information that is somewhat hidden and that is shared voluntarily. So self-disclosure by coercion generally doesn't work well. Also, self-disclosure tends to be verbal. Remember that verbal means use of words, not necessarily what's spoken. So you can self-disclose in a letter. Intentionality, again, it can't be coerced, and self-disclosure is critical, or it's critically connected with the notion of trust and has a lot to do with the health of relationships and keeping them vibrant and alive. In terms of opening up, the notion here is where trust gets involved. Trust is built and maintained when a relationship is willing to risk. And at first the risk is relatively safe. It's a sharing of a name, perhaps it's a sharing of a phone number, and the risk is relatively small. And then let's see how you do with those things. And if you're all right with use of my name, use of my address, relatively safe information, then maybe I'll disclose a little bit more, maybe whether or not I'm interested in a relationship or how my previous relationships have gone. And let's see what you do with that. And then if that goes well, then I'm willing to risk a little bit more, and maybe there's self-disclosure along the lines of fears and all those insecurities. So the ability to risk is critical to building trust in a relationship, and that's where self-disclosure comes into play. In fact, I would argue that self-disclosure is the lifeblood of a relationship. And when you have a relationship in which there's very little self-disclosure, the relationship is typically stagnant and oftentimes dying. Here we talk about it as a subjective process, so that relates to history and story. The story has to do with a narrative, that it's really a sharing, and is often related to that person's background. Different factors that influence, I think I went through this quick, so let's go back to this one. Factors that influence your self-disclosure. There are different personalities. Some people are really open. They were raised in an open environment. There's a lot of conversation. Some people are very, very private, and so you have certain personality differences that can influence what's self-disclosed. Other factors include things like this idea of gradual increase, the patterns of self-disclosure, slow buildup. If you've ever been on an airplane, sometimes you can be next to somebody and that person will tell you their entire life story in the course of your flight. Sometimes in a bar, there's a tremendous amount of self-disclosure with the bartender, or with females it can be with your beautician, getting your nails done. And different locations have a lot to do with self-disclosure as well. Other factors, certainly different cultures are a lot more expressive and, let's say, open, and that influences it. Women and men both tend to prefer to self-disclose to the opposite sex, which is interesting. Women tend to disclose more of a personal nature. Men will disclose a lot in terms of quantity, but it's typically about activities or hobbies or interests, and very rarely about things like weaknesses or fears. Different principles of self-disclosure. It doesn't take much for us to open up. In fact, self-disclosure is one of those things you ought to be looking at in the final project. Self-disclosures are reciprocated for the most part, the exception being, of course, a defined relationship that might be a therapist or a counselor, and they can gradually build. The interesting thing about self-disclosure is this notion of reciprocity that you see kind of highlighted right here. Reciprocity is interesting. If you've got somebody who is reluctant to self-disclose, reluctant to open up for whatever reason, one of the best ways you can get that person to begin to talk and to self-disclose is for you to self-disclose first. And in that process, many times the other person will respond with some self-disclosure. That might seem a little bit manipulative, but in some cases it's conducive to a relationship's developing, and truly it depends on the motives of the people involved. To explain self-disclosure, there are a few theories. The idea of dialectics has to do, when you're dealing with dialectics, you're almost dealing with dichotomies where you have an either or, you have opposite sides of the continuum. And it's sort of this push-pull for intimacy, for independence, you know, for this connection. And there are a lot of different dialectics that we, you know, need to navigate. And self-disclosure is one of the ways that we sort of attempt to balance those tensions between the opposite sides. In terms of reducing some of that tension, these things are mentioned in your book: cyclic alteration, segmentation, and selection. And you can go to the textbook for more details with all of these. It's a good way to sort of shorten the PowerPoint and at the same time encourage you to be in your textbooks. Explaining self-disclosure, I do want to touch on a few of the models that are connected to self-disclosure. The first is a very simple one, which is the social penetration model. And it basically has two different dimensions, that of breadth and that of depth. Breadth refers to the number of topics that are discussed. Depth refers to the amount of detail that we can disclose in it, in any situation. And let me go back to this one. I'm going to pause this for a second and see if I can give you a diagram that will help you understand this a little bit more. Okay, bear with me as I do this, and I'm going to see if I can draw this out for you a little bit, as if we were in a class with a chalkboard. In social penetration theory, there are two dimensions like the slide just mentioned. The first is breadth. If you think of breadth as sort of this wide range of topics, sort of covering the exterior of the circle. And then on the other hand, if you were to consider depth being more like this, okay, that would be how you would measure depth. The one along the side here would be breadth. Well, you can sort of diagram people in a similar way if you wanted to. For example, this might be your relationship with your mailman. Okay, you can talk about a lot of different things, but only in a very superficial manner. On the other hand, let's say a one-night stand is a relationship that consists of a tremendous amount of depth in a particular area with very little breadth. Now, the interesting thing to me, to give you sort of a metaphor, if you were to consider these as heels to a shoe, okay, here we have a spike heel. It's very fragile. It's very, it's likely to break. It's very hard for a relationship to make it when it's built like this, versus the relationship up here with the mailman that was very broad, very safe. There's little risk. The deeper the intimacy without building the corresponding breadth at the same time, the more fragile the self-disclosure. And self-disclosure can be on many different levels. So I hope that helps. All right, so the first model that you looked at, we just got done looking at, was social penetration. The second model is this one. It's the Johari window. And the Johari window is basically a matrix. There are these two different dimensions, that which is known to self, here and here, and that which is not known to self, here and here. The information that's known to others, which goes left to right, and information that's not known to others. So with these four different quadrants. Now, if there is information that you know and I know, it's in the open. If there is information that maybe I'm unaware of, but I've disclosed to you, or you figured out, that would be information I'm blind. Secrets I have would be hidden. The unknown category we actually don't know exists. We merely assume that it does. And here are all of those explained and defined, and you can go to the textbook for detail on that. There are different reasons to self-disclose. It helps you achieve catharsis and be healthy. Also helps your mental awareness. It's very beneficial in relationship, as I talked about, and here are some clear reasons for that. I'm just looking down and realizing how long I've gone, so I want to go a little bit quicker here. There are some reasons not to self-disclose. First is people don't want to be rejected, nor do they want to create a false or a negative impression, and so they won't self-disclose for that reason. They want to have an image, they want to, a front they want to maintain, and some simply would rather choose to bury information. Suggestions for effective self-disclosure are given in the textbook, the idea of I statements and honesty, as well as consistency and focus. Okay, so I think that is essentially it for this chapter, and that's it. I'll see you online.